With the Continental Army's historic victory at Saratoga, the end of the Revolutionary War is finally coming into sight. But that victory didn't just boost morale, it delivered a totally unexpected gift to the Continental Army, a gift that would become the decisive blow securing America's complete independence. So what exactly was this gift that finally severed the iron grip Britain held over America? Let's unravel that mystery right now. The triumph at Saratoga provided the Continental Army with the extra firepower they desperately needed to win the war. And what was that decisive blow? It was the alliance. Because of this victory, France finally agreed to join the fight. The colonial leaders realized a hard truth. They couldn't win this war alone. They needed a heavy hitter in their corner. So who was the perfect candidate? France. Why France? Simple. They were dying to see Britain knock down a peg. They knew that if Britain lost a huge chunk of its empire, France stood to gain the most power in Europe. But did France jump in to help right away? Not exactly. At first, they slipped us some supplies under the table, but they were hesitant to officially recognize the United States as a real country. That's when Benjamin Franklin stepped in. He crossed the Atlantic to personally charm the French into giving us official support. But it wasn't easy. The French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, laid down the law. He basically said, "Show me proof that you can actually win this war." And that's where Franklin played his ace. He presented the victory at Saratoga as undeniable proof that the Americans were the real deal. When news of Saratoga hit London in December 1777, it sent shockwaves through the government. British Prime Minister Lord North scrambled to offer a desperate peace deal. He basically told the colonies, "Look, if you stop fighting, we'll give you total self-rule within the empire." This terrified the French Foreign Minister, Vergennes. He was afraid the Americans might actually take the bait. If they did, France would lose its golden opportunity to crush Britain once and for all. So he didn't wait. On February 6, 1778, France officially recognized the United States as a sovereign nation and declared war on Britain. The floodgates opened, and they promised massive military aid, money, and weapons. And the cost? It was astronomical. France poured about 1.3 billion livres into this war. In today's money, we're talking over $5.5 billion. But here's the tragic irony. This massive spending completely bankrupted France. Not only that, French soldiers returned home infected with the American spirit of liberty and freedom, which helped spark the French Revolution. In the end, the very alliance that saved America led to the downfall of the French monarchy, eventually costing King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette their heads. With France entering the fray, this wasn't just a colonial rebellion anymore. It exploded into a full-blown global conflict. Britain's old rivals, Spain and the Netherlands, saw blood in the water and jumped in to support the Americans with money and supplies. France didn't just send checks, though. They provided the one thing America desperately lacked: a navy and an expeditionary force. This was crucial for the endgame. So what was the knockout punch? It was the combination of a hardened Continental Army and the sheer military muscle of France. In the beginning, Britain tried to play it smart. Instead of total war, they tried to win over the loyalists, colonists who still bowed to the king. They wanted to win hearts and minds. But that strategy backfired. As the fighting spread to isolated communities, more civilians got caught in the crossfire. Instead of loyalty, the British accidentally fueled the fire for independence. Meanwhile, up north, the war hit a stalemate. In May 1778, Sir Henry Clinton took command and pulled British troops back from Philadelphia to New York. While the British sat tight in New York, the Americans made a move. George Rogers Clark led a daring expedition over the Appalachian Mountains, seizing key settlements in the Illinois Territory from the British and their native allies. The British were masters of conventional warfare, lining up and shooting, but they were getting absolutely exhausted by the Continental Army's hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. Realizing they were stuck, Britain decided to roll the dice on one final gamble. They needed a new strategy, so they turned their eyes to the South. The plan was clear: secure the South, rally the Loyalist militias, and then march on Virginia. They figured if they could crush Virginia, the heart of the rebellion, they could finally turn the tide of the war. They also set their sights on a port town called Yorktown. The goal was to turn it into a naval base where the British fleet could come and go as they pleased. Enter Lord Cornwallis, the British commander in the South. He wasted no time. On August 16, 1780, at the Battle of Camden, he absolutely crushed the Continental Army. It was a disaster for the Americans. Desperate to save the South, Congress played their best card. They sent Nathaniel Greene, arguably their most brilliant strategist next to Washington. But here's the thing, even before Greene arrived, the momentum was already shifting. October 10, 1780, Kings Mountain. A group of American frontier riflemen stormed out of the woods and completely wiped out over 1,000 of Cornwallis's reinforcements. It was a stunning ambush. When Greene took command, he refused to play by British rules. He avoided direct open battles. Instead, he split his army into mobile units to bait, harass, and frustrate Cornwallis. This wasn't just good strategy, it proved the Continental Army had evolved enough to pull off complex maneuvers. Eventually, Greene gathered his full strength for a ferocious showdown at Guilford Courthouse. The British technically won the field, but the cost was devastating. They lost so many men that they had to abandon the campaign in the Carolinas entirely. Instead, Cornwallis moved north to raid Virginia. But needing to protect his dwindling forces, he made a fateful decision: to dig in and wait for supplies at Yorktown. And that was the mistake. It left the main British forces dangerously split between Yorktown and New York. The trap was set. With the British dug into Yorktown, the war hung in the balance. The French allies saw a golden opportunity and insisted on striking Yorktown immediately before the British could fortify further. George Washington pulled off a masterstroke of deception. He secretly moved the entire combined army south to Yorktown with lightning speed, catching everyone off guard. Meanwhile, Admiral de Grasse sailed his massive French fleet into the Chesapeake Bay, effectively blocking off the York River. The trap was snapped shut. The French Navy cut off any escape by sea, while Allied ground forces surrounded the town. The numbers were overwhelming. 15,000 Allied troops against a British force half that size. Cornwallis hunkered down, praying that Sir Henry Clinton would rush down from New York with reinforcements. But that help was never coming. Clinton was paralyzed in New York, fearing that leaving his base would leave him vulnerable to attack. Cornwallis was on his own. The British dug in behind their defensive redoubts. The Franco-American forces responded with classic siege tactics, digging parallel trenches that inched closer and closer to the British lines. Back then, charging a fortified position head-on was a suicide mission. The solution was to dig zigzagging trenches. This allowed the troops to safely advance toward the walls without exposing themselves to direct fire down a straight line. The British rained down cannon fire to stop the digging, but the Allies were relentless. The noose was tightening, and there was nothing Cornwallis could do to stop it. As the trenches inched closer, the Allied firepower became overwhelming. The French artillery, the precursors to Napoleon's legendary corps and arguably the best in the world at the time, were surgical with their aim. They systematically silenced the British guns. Cornwallis was checkmated. Yorktown turned into a living hell. As the noose tightened, shells rained down on the town non-stop. Crammed into damp underground bunkers with civilians, the British troops became a breeding ground for disease. Sickness spread like wildfire, taking hundreds of soldiers out of the fight. The Allied stranglehold was complete. Cut off from all supplies, the British were starving. Their only hope was the Royal Navy, but even they were paralyzed by the sheer dominance of the French fleet. Think about that. The Royal Navy had ruled the waves for 2 centuries, but right here, at this moment, they suffered a rare and total humiliation. It was as if history decided they had to take a fall just so America could rise. Desperate and out of options, Cornwallis tried a risky nighttime escape across the river, but a storm ruined even that plan. Finally, in October 1781, he bowed to the inevitable. He surrendered his entire army of over 7,000 men. Britain's final gamble to crush the revolution had failed. The war was effectively over. So here's the million-dollar question. How on earth did the most powerful military machine in the world lose to a ragtag army of colonists? From a tactical standpoint, the British commanders were fundamentally lost. They simply didn't know how to fight this kind of war. Usually, to crush a rebellion, you have a standard playbook. Capture the capital, seize the economic hubs, or wipe out the rebel army. You either break their will or prop up the local loyalists to take over. But here's the kicker. None of that worked here. Why? Because the 13 colonies didn't have a capital. Not really. New York was just a big trading hub. Philadelphia was just a meeting hall. In short, there was no London in America to burn down and claim victory. Chasing these phantom capitals just split the British forces apart. Clinton was in New York, Howe was in Philly, they were scattered. And General Burgoyne, he marched all the way from Canada only to vanish into defeat. The tyranny of distance was real. With the Atlantic Ocean between them and home, the British were terrified of pushing too deep inland. If they chased the Americans too far, they outran their supply lines. And the logistics were a nightmare. Guerrillas constantly ambushed their supply trains, and the British couldn't stop them. They were effectively paralyzed, unable to penetrate the interior. This lack of strategic targets gave the Americans a massive advantage: mobility. This created 2 huge problems for the British. First, they could never force a fight on their terms. In war, the side that chooses the battlefield wins. But whenever the British set up a fight, the Americans would just slip away. Then the Americans would pop up somewhere else and say, "Hey, we're over here," forcing the British to come to them. The Americans dictated the map. Even when the British won, like at Bunker Hill, they bled too much. Fighting on American-chosen ground meant heavy casualties. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, leading them straight into isolation and ruin. Second problem, the so-called loyalists weren't that loyal. The British were operating in deep, hostile territory. It was an intelligence black hole. They couldn't even send out scouts without them getting attacked. Small scouting parties got beaten up by villagers. The land was too vast to map properly. Worse, the locals fed them fatal lies about river depths and terrain. This disinformation led the British into trap after trap. In the end, Britain simply lost the will to fight. Realizing the war was unwinnable, they sued for peace. And so, after 8 long years of blood and strategy, the American Revolutionary War finally came to an end.